Hi guys! So when I was uploading my last video on my relationship with Wicca, I was looking for a specific video. I often like to create links to past videos at specific points in the video. If I talk about a particular topic and I have it in mind that I made a video on that topic, I will often create a link up above for you to follow if you're interested in hearing more on that topic from me. And I had it in mind that I had created more than one video specifically about my relationship to divinity as a pantheist and what that relationship might feel like and how I kind of go about cultivating that relationship. And when I went to go and find that video, I realised that I had never actually really covered this topic specifically. I have kind of danced around it in various videos. I've talked about being a pantheist. I've talked about the problem of if everything is sacred, then is anything special. I've talked about the Morrigan and specific deities. I've talked about my shifting kind of relationship with pantheism and polytheism and basically various different components of that. But I've never actually specifically made a video talking about what it feels like to commune with divinity as a pantheist, what that looks like for me and how I go about it. I think that the main reason for this is because it is actually quite a personal topic. It's actually quite a vulnerable thing to talk about publicly. And I'm not about to go and open up about things that I'm not willing to open up about, or to delve into experiences that I don't want to describe in too much detail or anything. But I just decided that I did want to make a video on this topic. So the first thing I would say is that the reason that I haven't really made this video in the past is that it's actually very hard to discuss or describe what it feels like to me when I feel like I'm connecting to divinity. By definition, as a pantheist, divinity is a pretty vague and amorphous concept. So because all of existence to me is divine, because the entire universe is divine, it can be pretty tricky to isolate any component of that, and that is kind of what I was talking about in those videos that I made about the kind of relationship between kind of the sacred, everything being sacred and certain things being special, or everything being divine and certain things being sacred, and separating out the two. It is a pretty difficult thing to kind of concretely define, I guess. And for me, that is absolutely the point of being a pantheist. The point of being a pantheist to me is to let go of any very specific notions that I might have tried to grapple with in the past about one specific element of the universe being divine, or finding something in existence or in my everyday experience of life that feels like divinity in a way that nothing else does. So to some extent you could say that me communing with divinity, or me feeling close to divinity, is really just me living life. That every single experience I have on this planet to me is part of my relationship with the divine, and that is absolutely true. But I will say that it's not always the forefront thing in my mind, and that is the difficult part of being a pantheist and having a spirituality or a religion when you are a pantheist. It's a bit tricky. If you're the kind of person who's happy enough to kind of make that decision, make that kind of logical or theoretical decision for yourself, and then kind of move on with your life and not do anything about it, then that might be fine. But I have evolved into the kind of person who really likes to have a spiritual practice, who likes to do something about my beliefs about the universe, who likes ritual, and who likes to celebrate the divinity of the universe. So finding ways to relate to that and to feel that rather than just think it or know it, that can be kind of challenging. So obviously, if you're following my channel, if you've seen other videos of mine, then you know some of the things that I do to relate to divinity. I meditate every day. For me, that is a religious practice. I find it easier to maintain a meditation practice because I know that it is good for my mental health, because I know that it's just good for my well-being in general. But I would say that the driving force behind my decision to meditate every day is that the kind of state that it gets me into, the kind of mental state that it gets me into, is one, I wouldn't say necessarily one in which I feel as though I'm connected to the divine in a way that I'm not usually, although you could say that, and I'll get to that in a minute. But certainly I feel like it puts me in a state of mind where I'm more able to remember. I am more able to be aware of my surroundings and aware of just my existence and aware of the moment, the present moment, in the present moment. And that to me is often just the key element in feeling close to divinity. Because if you're on autopilot, if I'm just going about my day-to-day life, I get very bogged down in the small things and in the detail and just in the kind of routine of what it is that I'm doing, and I'm thinking on quite a small scale human level. Whereas the more I meditate, the more I practice being in that kind of mindset where I'm releasing my ego, the more I'm expanding out to a broader kind of perspective on the world, and then that in turn just makes me feel more connected to the wider universe and by extension to divinity. And then I would say that the second biggest thing that I do in general to connect to divinity, to feel connected to divinity, to have that experience is just anything that I do at the altar. I don't differentiate hugely between just casual time spent at the altar and doing ritual, because for me it's all on a continuum. I build my altars specifically in an effort to tap me into a certain mindset, and I reflect certain elements of the universe and certain elements of my understanding of the universe as I have built it up through my reading and through just my exploration of different ideas. I specifically reflect that in the symbolism on my altar, and I've worked on cultivating that over a long period of time. I mean, it will be coming up on 10 years, I think, sometime next year, that I have been continuously having an altar that I go to pretty much every day, that I spend time at every day, and through trial and error. And I mean, it changes all the time as well, because I will discover new ideas and change my old ideas about things, and the old symbolism just might not quite work for me anymore, and I just have to kind of constantly renew that and constantly refresh that, and constantly be kind of honest with myself about whether or not the symbolism that I'm using on that altar is actually making me think and is actually taking me out of my mundane mindset and putting me into that kind of divine mindset where I am connected to that idea and that fundamental experience of the universe being divine. I will say though that somewhere along the line of the continuum between just sitting down at the altar for a couple of minutes and doing a full-blown scripted ritual with incense and specific words for specific moments and actions and all sorts of different kind of components to it, somewhere along that line there is kind of a shift in kind of my consciousness and my awareness that does start to move me away from just feeling like I'm remembering that the universe is divine towards a sort of suspension of disbelief, I guess you could call it, or just maybe a movement into a slightly different kind of belief. And when I'm in that kind of space, it feels a bit more like I'm not just remembering that I'm choosing to believe that everything around me is divine. It feels sometimes in those moments as though I am actually connecting to some kind of external entity or external consciousness or external awareness at least that is in some way divine, specially divine, and in some way is maybe not governing the universe, but that it is overlooking it, or is in some way this kind of wider universal consciousness. And that to me, there is kind of a difference between the kind of everyday awareness of the divinity of the universe and those kind of mystical moments that are very hard to describe, very hard to define. And honestly, when I'm not in them, when I'm not in that kind of moment, in that kind of mindset, not in that state of consciousness, it feels a bit kooky and it feels a bit like I'm just kind of making it up, or it's not really real. And it's taken me a long time to get to the point of being comfortable with that and not constantly chasing a more kind of stable version of that. So I think for the first maybe 5 years or more of my spirituality in my 20s, I kind of thought that eventually I might have an experience or I might get so adept at ritual that I would have so many experiences of that nature that I would be able to carry that experience, or at least the beliefs based on that experience, into my everyday life, and that it would fundamentally shift my beliefs and shift my experience of everyday life. And I just kept finding that that didn't happen. And I think it wasn't really until I started to have experiences that were really just so intense at the time and so strange at the time, but they didn't actually translate in any way long term into my day-to-day experience of life. They didn't actually fundamentally shift or change my beliefs about how the world works. And I think once that started to happen, it wasn't until that started to happen that I finally started to realise this is never really going to change. I think, you know, my very kind of scientific based, quite logical understanding and belief system of how the universe works and how my day-to-day existence works, I don't really think that's ever going to shift hugely. That's not to say that there isn't space within that for understanding things in a different way, for taking on different kinds of theories and thinking about things in various different ways. Because it's not a fundamental dogmatic set of hard and fast rules about how the universe has to behave or how we are made up and how our consciousness works and everything like that. It's not so much, like I say, a dogmatic list of facts. It's much more so a fundamental kind of way of going about exploring how the universe works. And I suppose at the end of the day, where I place my trust and what authorities at the end of the day that I actually really truly can believe in and can place my trust in, and fundamentally that actually just kind of shape my belief system. What I have found over time is that I can, to some degree, find that my beliefs will shift and change based on scientific theories that I read and explore and find out about, or new historical data that I am made aware of. Anything that seems scientific to me, I'm more likely to be able to take on board and feel really fundamentally as though it's kind of objectively true. And on the other side, there is personal experience. And I think for a long time I thought that there had to be kind of some sort of, the two kind of sides had to speak to one another, or would eventually speak to one another. And that I would feel more satisfied with my worldview once those two things kind of came into harmony. What I have come to realise is that, for me at least, those two things are very, very separate. And at the end of the day, my subjective experience or reading about other people's subjective experiences are never going to alter what I understand to be objective reality. It's never going to alter my perception of that. It's never going to alter my belief systems around objective reality. But what I have come to respect more and more is that subjective reality is important in its own right. And it's a very different kind of thing. It's a very different kind of way of engaging with reality. And it is actually pretty fundamentally important as well. And I have kind of given up on trying to make the two things harmonise and kind of trying to make the two things come together as one. So when I talk about relating to divinity and feeling close to divinity, having an experience of divinity and making room for that in my life and making room for that in ritual and experiencing that through ritual, I'm kind of talking about two different things, and maybe I need to find language for separating the two different things when I talk about them, but I suppose it's not always so clear cut like which is which all the time, because it shifts sometimes between the two, and even within one ritual you're going to be doing two different things. So what I kind of talked about in the beginning of this video, and what for the most part for me feeling connected to divinity is the kind of objective reality, kind of logical part of me, remembering that I have chosen a particular philosophical path, that I have been convinced by this one particular philosophical argument, and that is my way, my lens by which I view the scientific reality of our universe. The other side of the coin, those kind of mystical experiences, are a completely different, they're a completely different ballgame. They are very, very difficult to achieve through conscious effort. Sometimes it feels like the harder you try to achieve those kinds of experiences, the more they slip your grasp. There are certainly certain techniques and tools and substances that you can consume and partake of that are going to pretty consistently get you there. But I guess that a lot of my practice involves, a lot of my practice to this point has involved just kind of the kind of logical side, and something that I'm interested in and I feel like I have kind of not achieved greatly up to this point is cultivating more of those practices that actually might more consistently get me into that kind of frame of mind. I'm not sure how realistic that is, and I'm not sure if that's something that even makes sense to be trying to achieve. I know that somebody left a comment on one of my videos one time, and I really wish I could remember who this was. It was a very interesting and insightful comment. And I think they said something along the lines that it's not something that I even should be seeking, and that if you're trying to seek those kind of experiences, you've kind of missed the point, or you've missed the mark somewhere, and that the only thing you can really do is to just sit back and let them happen when they happen, and appreciate them when they do happen, but not feel like we're missing the mark somehow if we go years without having that kind of experience. So that was kind of what I was getting at when I said that I felt like magic, engaging in magical practices in the past had taken me to that place, and that's why I'm kind of fascinated by certain things that don't necessarily make sense on the kind of logical side for me. What I meant was that they bring me into contact with a feeling of being in relationship with something greater than me and something outside of me that I can't explain through my logical understandings of the world, but that all the same I know that in the past when they've happened that they have felt very real. So that's basically all I have time for to get into today. This is a topic that I would like to pick back up again, I think, in the future if you're interested in hearing more about it, and if I think of any better ways to describe it or talk about it. Like I say, it is something that's hard to talk about, and it's something that is very personal but also completely indescribable. So you kind of have the two problems going on, that you don't necessarily want to open up something so personal and something so subjective to the public eye. But also, even if you wanted to, it's often completely impossible to put into words. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts, especially if you are a pantheist or you have some sort of similar relationship to religion as me. Actually, I'd also really love to hear from you if you have a very different kind of worldview from me, or very different beliefs. I think a lot of you who watch me have similar beliefs to me, but I would love to hear from those of you who have maybe more literal beliefs. Literal isn't really the right word, is it? Or believe in some kind of personified or personal divinity, I suppose. Do you relate to those things that I've said about those two different parts of experience, or different ways of viewing the world? And how does that make you feel about your relationship to divinity? Are you having more of those kind of mystical experiences than I am? And if so, why do you think that is? I'd love to know. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So yeah, as always, thanks a million for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell if you haven't already, and I will talk to you again soon.